Question 1. An investor consults an investment manager to advise him regarding a certain portfolio that would give him at least a 7% return on his investment or his threshold return. The investment manager presents 3 portfolios exhibited in the following table. So we've got portfolios A, B, and C, and we have their expected returns and standard deviations. Using the safety first ratio assumption, the portfolio that is most suitable for the investor is portfolio A, B, or C. So our safety first ratio is going to be the expected return of the portfolio, and then we're going to subtract out the threshold return or required minimum rate of return, and then divide that by the standard deviation. So it's kind of similar to like the Sharpe ratio calculation. We're just using our required return instead of risk-free return. And so higher number is better. And so whatever portfolio has the highest number is going to be the more optimal portfolio for us. So here's what those calculations look like. Safety first ratio, again, expected return of the portfolio. So for A, that's 19. For B, that's 23, and C, that's 36. And we can see those plugged in right there. And then both are going to have that same required return of 7%, which is that given threshold up here. And then we'll divide by the standard deviation. So we've got 14 for A, 26 for B, and 39 for C. And that gives us these 3 numbers here, and we can see that A is the highest, so that's going to be our answer. Answer A, portfolio A. Question 2. Which of the following is the most appropriate explanation of a -1 correlation between 2 random variables? So as a reminder, correlations can fall between -1 and +1 and can be anywhere in between. So -1 is basically the lowest possible correlation that 2 variables could have. So A, both variables move together in a negative direction. So both variables are going to move together, but not necessarily in a negative direction. When we have a -1 correlation, it essentially just means that they're going to be moving in opposite directions. So if this is the return stream of one of those, the other would kind of look something like this, making our DNA. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. So it's not one is moving in a positive direction, the other is moving negative. They're not both moving negative together. So we can rule out A. B, there is no correlation between 2 random variables. So they're actually highly correlated. They're just moving in opposite directions. If there was no correlation, that would be a 0 correlation. So we can rule out B as well. So let's make sure we can choose C. The movement in one variable will result in the exact opposite proportional movement in the other variable, and that is going to be correct. So if one variable, if we're using asset returns, for example, if one asset is up 10% and the other variable moves in the opposite direction, then that one should be down 10%. Answer C. Question 3. Lifeline Incorporated is a manufacturer of swimming safety gear. Lifeline intends to expand production by purchasing and converting vacant property for factory use. The total purchase cost will amount to $350,000. Lifeline will make a down payment of $50,000, so it's going to be a $300,000 loan. It intends to finance the remainder using a 20-year loan with quarterly payments. The bank has quoted interest rate of 6% with quarterly compounding, and the first loan payment is due 1 year from the present day. Each quarterly payment paid by Lifeline Incorporated to its bank is closest to. So we're going to be using our time value of money calculator here. And here's what those inputs are going to look like. So our N is going to be that 20-year loan period multiplied by 4 for the quarterly payments. So we'll have 80 payments. Our interest rate is going to be that 6% divided by 4 since we're quarterly compounding. So that input will be 1.5%. Present value is going to be $300,000, that loan amount. And then our future value will be 0 since we're going to pay down the loan to 0. And then we're going to solve for the payment amount. So let me pull in the calculator here. Let me get that situated. Okay, so I've got all of the numbers already input. So we can see I've got 80 for N, 1.5 for interest rate, 300,000 for present value, and 0 for future value. So from here, you'll hit compute payment, and we can see that gives us 6464.4969. So with rounding, that's going to be answer B. Question 4. Yard Incorporated maintains a defined contribution plan permitting employees to make annual contributions of $35,000 into the plan. To generate the required annual contribution, several of Yard's employees invest the amount at the end of each year in an exchange-traded fund that will pay an annual return of 8% for the next 35 years. If the plan generates its promised return, the amount of money each employee will have for retirement after making the last payment is closest to 0.8 million, 6 million, or 6.5 million. So we're going to be using our time value of money calculator again for this problem. This is what those inputs are going to look like. So for n, we'll have 35, and that's just going to be simply the number of years. And we're doing annual returns, so we don't need to adjust that at all. And for interest rate, we'll have 8%. Again, don't need to adjust it since we're doing annual. And then payments, we've got contribution of $35,000 per year, so that's going to be going in. And then present value will have 0 since there's no mention of any current assets that employees have in the plan. And then we're going to be solving for future value. So let me pull in the calculator again, and we will calculate this out. So for n, we've got 35. Interest rate, we've got 8. Again, present value is currently 0, and then payment 35,000. So when we compute future value, we get a little over 6 million, so 6.03 million. So that's going to be closest to answer B, 6.0 million. Question 5. Singh, an analyst at Delta Advisory Firm, has prepared a regression analysis comparing the price of gold to the average cost of purchases of finished gold jewelry of a retailer of fine jewelry and watches. The regression results are shown in Exhibit 1 below. So we've got our exhibit, annual data, so 31 observations, and then we've got our intercept and coefficient, and then the cost of gold and the coefficient. And then those standard errors. Singh commented, "We may have a problem with parameter instability if the relationship between gold prices and jewelry costs has changed over the past 30 years. So what this is essentially saying is parameter instability, meaning if this relationship has changed over the past 30 years, looking back at the history of that relationship may not be helpful for understanding that relationship going forward. Which could certainly be true if that relationship has changed." And then Baker computes the test statistic and concluded that we failed to reject the null hypothesis that the slope coefficient is equal to 4.0 at the 5% significance level. All right. And then here we have our question. Are Singh statement 1 and Baker statement 2 correct or incorrect regarding the usefulness of regression results described in Exhibit 1 and the value of the slope coefficient? Use the excerpt of the t-table below. So these statements, we've got both are correct, both are incorrect, or Singh is incorrect and Baker is correct. So we kind of talked about Singh already, and this one would be correct. If that relationship hasn't been stable or has changed a lot over time, then it's not going to be predictive, making our model kind of inaccurate. So Singh is correct. So we've got both are incorrect. We can rule that out. Singh is incorrect. We can also rule that out. So just by default, we could go with A if we were in a bit of a rush. But let's look at Baker's statement as well, just to suss this out and make sure we understand why this one is correct, since it should be according to our question. All right, so we need to compute the test statistic. So we fail to reject the null hypothesis. The slope coefficient is equal to 4 at a 5% significance level. So this is going to be a two-tailed test. And since we're looking at 5% significance, we're actually going to be doing P equals 0.025. So this is what we're going to be testing against. We have 31 observations, and so our degrees of freedom is going to be that 31 minus 1, so degrees of freedom will be 30, and so we're going to be comparing against a critical value of 2.042, and since it's a two-sided test, it'll be 2.042 or minus 2.042. So if our value falls in between that range, we're not going to be able to reject the null, which is what we're saying here would be correct. If it lies above 2.042 or below minus 2.042, then we would be able to reject the null. So calculating that t statistic, here's what those numbers are going to look like. So we're going to take that cost of gold coefficient, subtract out 4, which is what we're testing for in our test, and then divide that by the standard error, which is given at 0.615, gives us minus 1.793, which is going to fall between those significant or those critical value numbers, and we will fail to reject the null hypothesis, helping us prove that both these statements are correct. Answer A. Question 6. As the sample size increases, the standard error of the sample mean is most likely to increase, decrease, or remains unchanged. I think the easiest way to kind of demonstrate this is to show a very, very simple example. So using the standard error formula. So our standard error formula is standard deviation divided by n, divided by the square root of n, or n to the 0.5, which is how I write it out here. So if the sample size increases, what happens to the standard error? So I'm just going to use 10 as our standard deviation in both examples and then change this variable. So we'll use 5 as our number of observations for our sample size, and then 10 in the second example. So when we just do this very simple example, we can see in the first scenario we're at 4.4, and then by increasing that sample size, it gets us to 3.16. And so as we increase sample size, our standard error should decrease. And thinking about this kind of more theoretically as well, as we have more and more observations, that should make our sample more accurate or representative of the population and lead to kind of that lower standard error number as well. Answer B. Question 7. Which of the following is least likely an example of non-state actors in geopolitics? So least likely an example of non-state actors. So we're going to be looking for I guess there will be 2 non-state actors and then 1 state actor. A state actor is likely going to be something more like a government entity, something like that. So A, Coca-Cola. So Coca-Cola is going to be a non-state actor. Since they're not government affiliated, it's a publicly traded company with shareholders, and that's who they answer to, not any government entity. B, the Malaysian Parliament. Sounds like that will be our answer, since the Malaysia Parliament is going to be government related and they'll be a state actor. And C, the CEO of Microsoft Corporation falls in that same category as Coca-Cola. They'll be non-state. And so we will go with answer B, Malaysian Parliament. Question 8. Profit maximization conditions for firms under imperfect competition is A, marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost. Total revenue equals total cost. So looking at these 2 parts to this question, so if total revenue equals total cost, that's going to be 0 profit. So under profit maximization conditions, that's probably not going to be what we're looking for. And also, if marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, meaning that if we can produce 1 additional unit, our revenue on that unit is greater than the cost on that unit, we could be making more profit. So that's not going to be a condition either, and these also just kind of contradict each other. So we can rule out A. For B, marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and then total revenue minus total cost is at its maximum. So total revenue minus total cost at its maximum, that's going to be indicative of profit maximization. Our profit is revenue minus cost, so if that's at the max, that would indicate we're maximizing profit. And marginal revenue equaling marginal cost is going to indicate each additional unit, the next additional unit that we want to produce is going to net us $0 in more profit. So we would want to stop producing there because we're not going to make any more profit and we're already maxed out. So it looks like B is our answer. Let's make sure we can rule out C. So marginal revenue equal marginal cost. That's good again, same as what we had up here. But then for the second part, we have total revenue minus total cost is at its minimum. Again, if we're maximizing profit, we want this number to be higher, not lower. So we can rule out C. Question 9. Consider the following annual returns. So we've got 3.4, 5.6, 1.2, 7.2, and 6.7%, 5 years worth of returns. The resulting geometric and arithmetic means returns are closest to. So let's go ahead and calculate these. For geometric, that's going to be compounding returns. So we're going to be doing 1 plus each of these different return streams and then multiplying them over time. So we'll have 1.034 times 1.056 times 1.012 and so on down the line. And then at the end, what we're going to do is we're going to do it to the nth root. So we have 5 years worth of returns. So we're going to do to the 5th root, or to the raised to the 1 divided by 5. And then we need to subtract out 1. So that gives us 1.048 minus 1, or 0.048%. And so that there's, we likely just have some rounding differences here. So we can rule out C. It looks like we'll be at A or B, depending on our arithmetic mean. And then for arithmetic, this is the simple average. So we're just going to add up all 5 of these return streams and then divide by 5. And when we do that, we get 4.82. So we can rule out A, and we're good on answer B. Question 10. Veronica Rose borrowed $5,000 from Contra Bank. The terms and conditions of the loan are given in the following table. So it's a short-term loan, $5,000, 3 years, 3 equal payments. So 3 equal annual payments, assuming rate of 3%, and no prepayment penalty. So you can pay early if you want. However, Rose decides to make a payment of $2,000 at the end of the first year. So instead of those 3 equals, we're doing $2,000 at the end of the first year. The amount of each payment required for the remaining 2 years to pay off the remains of the loan are closest to. So instead of making 3 equal payments, we're now making a $2,000 payment, and then we need to do 2 more. Then we need to calculate what the 2 more equal payments will be. So to calculate this, we're going to be using our time value of money calculator eventually, but the first thing we need to do is figure out our new loan balance after this $2,000 payment. So the interest accrued over that first year is going to be $5,000 times 0.03, so $150. And so then we're going to add that back to the $5,000, and then we subtract out that $2,000 payment that we made to get a new loan balance of $3,150. And then now that we have this loan balance, we're going to be able to come in here and bring in the calculator to do this. So we've got 2 years left on the loan, interest rate of 3%, and these are annualized because we're doing 2 years, 2 payments. So no adjustments needed. Present value is that new loan balance, 3,150. Future value will be 0 since we're paying down that loan, and then the payment we are going to solve for. So, sorry, I already have the answer up there, but we've got all our inputs in there. We've got n equals 2, 3% interest rate, present value 3,150, and then payment, future value of 0, and then we're going to compute that payment, and we get 1646.22, which is going to correspond right here with answer A.